Have you ever wondered what drives a human being to burn down everything they've known, everyone they've loved, just to stop a cycle of horror that would otherwise continue for generations? There are stories buried in the soil of Mississippi that the history books dare not touch. Stories whispered in the dead of night, passed down through coded songs and silent gestures. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of suffering from America's darkest chapter. This is something far more sinister, far more calculated. This is about a man who didn't just steal freedom. He engineered an entire bloodline, treating human beings like livestock, forcing brother upon sister, father upon daughter, creating a legacy of silence and genetic devastation that would haunt a community for over a century. Tonight, I'm taking you inside Blackwood Plantation in Issaquena County, Mississippi, 1847, where a woman named Dinah witnessed something so profoundly evil that it transformed her from a healer into an architect of the most elaborate act of retribution the antebellum South had ever seen. If you're ready to confront a truth that will shake you to your core, if you believe some stories must be told no matter how uncomfortable they make us, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Dinah didn't just destroy one plantation. It sparked a method of resistance that would terrify slaveholders across 3 states. I promise you this. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why certain names were erased from official records, why certain bloodlines still carry genetic markers of this horror, and why Dinah's final words became a battle cry that echoes even today. The fire she lit never truly went out. The ruins still stand. What remains of Blackwood Plantation rises from the Mississippi bottomlands like broken teeth, brick chimneys clawing at a sky that has witnessed everything and absolved nothing. Kudzu has claimed most of it now, green tendrils strangling the columns where iron rings once held human beings in place. The air here tastes different, thick with humidity and something older, something that clings to the back of your throat like ash from a fire that burned 177 years ago, but somehow never finished consuming what it started. Walk these grounds at dusk, and the earth itself seems to remember. The soil is darker here, enriched by generations of blood and sweat, by bodies buried in unmarked plots, by children who never lived to see their 5th birthday, because their parents were cousins, were siblings, were father and daughter. The local historians don't talk about Blackwood. The plantation tours that dot Highway 61 skip this location entirely. There's no historical marker, no bronze plaque explaining what happened here. But the people who live in the shotgun houses along the river, the descendants who still carry the Blackwood name though they've never received a cent of Blackwood money, they know. They've always known. This is where genetic horror met human calculation. Where a man named Cornelius Blackwood looked at the human beings he enslaved and saw not people, but breeding stock. Where he kept meticulous records, now housed in a sealed archive at Ole Miss, accessible only by special permission, detailing which enslaved woman was matched with which enslaved man, tracking bloodlines with the same precision a horse breeder tracks thoroughbreds, first cousins to first cousins, half-siblings to half-siblings. And when those unions produced children with twisted limbs and minds that couldn't hold a thought, when babies died in their first weeks with hearts that never formed properly, Blackwood documented it all in his neat, careful handwriting. Subject 23F. Unsuccessful breeding. Excess genetic compression. Terminated. He called it bloodline consolidation. He believed he was creating a superior type of enslaved person, more obedient, more dependent, more controllable. What he actually created was a chamber of genetic horrors that medical researchers are still studying today. And at the center of it all was Dinah. If you want to follow more cases like this, that shake society to its foundations and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The document crackles in the climate-controlled vault where I examined it last month. Cornelius Blackwood's Plantation Ledger, 1839, 1851. The pages smell of decay and something else, something chemical, as if the paper itself is trying to dissolve rather than continue bearing witness to what's written there. But the ink holds. The numbers hold. 243 enslaved people listed by age, skill, and most disturbingly, by parentage. Arrows connect names. Circles denote approved pairings. Red X marks through those who failed to produce viable offspring. Page 47. That's where Dinah first appears. Female, age 19, medical knowledge, high intelligence, unsuitable for field work. Assigned healing duties. Observation recommended. That last notation. Observation recommended. That was Blackwood's code for enslaved people he deemed too aware, too capable, the ones who had to be watched. Blackwood Plantation sprawled across 2,400 acres of Mississippi Delta, its boundaries marked by cypress swamps to the west and the Yazoo River's muddy current to the east. The big house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in the brutal summer sun, its 42 windows like eyes watching everything, everyone. Behind it, the nightmare began. The quarters, 42 cabins arranged in precise rows, each structure identical, 12 feet by 14 feet, housing anywhere from 8 to 12 people. No windows, single doors that locked from the outside. The roofs were deliberate engineering, just low enough that standing upright for too long caused neck pain, just high enough that you couldn't fully lie down and stretch without touching another body. This was calculated discomfort, designed to ensure even rest brought no relief. Between the quarters and the fields stood the breeding house. That's what the enslaved community called it, though Blackwood's records termed it the consolidation facility. A converted barn, 80 feet long, divided into 12 small rooms. Each room contained a straw mattress, a water bucket, and iron rings embedded in the floor. The doors had no locks on the inside. Guard rotations ensured constant surveillance. This is where Blackwood's grand design became flesh. The hierarchy was absolute and precisely maintained. At the apex, Cornelius Blackwood himself, 46 years old in 1847, educated at William and Mary, a man who quoted Plato while implementing policies that would make a livestock breeder blanch. Below him, his overseer Jameson Thorne, a man who'd learned his trade managing horse breeding operations in Kentucky and brought that same cold efficiency to human reproduction. Then came the drivers, enslaved men forced to enforce Blackwood's will or watch their own families suffer. They carried leather straps and burden that broke most of them within 2 years. The day began before dawn. A bell, the same bell that still hangs rusted and silent near the ruins, rang at 4:30 a.m. The enslaved workers had 30 minutes to relieve themselves in the open trenches behind the quarters, to drink from the single well that served all 243 people, to chew on whatever cornmeal mush remained from the night before. By 5 a.m. they were in the fields. Cotton, mostly. The endless white flowers that demanded bending, pulling, bleeding fingers moving faster, always faster, filling sacks that grew heavier with each row, while the sun transformed the delta into an open-air furnace. The work continued until dark, 13, sometimes 15 hours of continuous labor. But for those assigned to the breeding house, the day followed a different rhythm. Breakfast brought separately, isolation from the general population, and then the waiting, the terrible waiting for Blackwood himself to arrive with his ledger, with his theories, with his pairings. The instruments of control were everywhere. The overseer carried a bullwhip, 9 feet of braided leather that could take skin off at 15 paces. But that was crude. Blackwood preferred psychological tools. The separation room in the big house, where children were held when their parents needed motivation. The breeding book, displayed publicly once a week, showing which families would be torn apart if quotas weren't met. The Sunday inspections, where Blackwood personally examined every enslaved person, noting in his journal their physical condition, their usefulness, their future assignments. The architecture itself was oppression made physical. The big house positioned on the highest ground, overlooking everything, the bell tower visible from every corner of the plantation. The quarters built deliberately too far from the river for easy water access, forcing people to walk past the overseer's cabin every morning and evening. Even the trees were strategic, cleared around the quarters to eliminate shade, but left thick around the big house to keep it cool. And the sounds, the constant grinding sounds, the bell that governed every moment, the crack of whips like gunshots at irregular intervals, keeping everyone on edge. The chains that certain enslaved people were forced to wear, rattling with each step, advertising their presence. The crying from the breeding house that the guards were instructed to ignore. But beneath it all, another sound, quieter, more dangerous, The sound of 243 people learning to communicate without words. The tap-tap-tap of coded messages on cabin walls at night. The specific way laundry was hung to signal warnings. The patterns hummed in work songs that seemed innocent, but carried maps, plans, names of those who needed watching. And watching. Always watching. Because in Blackwood's world, every action was documented. Every birth, every death, every instance of resistance. His journals filled shelf after shelf in his library, a library the enslaved people weren't allowed to see, but whose contents they somehow always knew about. Dinah knew. Dinah saw everything. The storm was building. It had been building since the first forced pairing, since the first baby born with eyes that didn't track right, lungs that couldn't quite fill, since the first time a woman was dragged to the breeding house, while her mother screamed in a language Blackwood had tried to erase but could never fully silence. The instruments were being sharpened. The fire was being banked. And Blackwood, surrounded by his books and his theories and his absolute certainty in his own righteousness, never saw it coming. The morning fog off the Yazoo was particularly thick the day everything began to crack. They called her Dinah the Healer, though she'd never chosen the title. At 31 years old in 1847, she carried knowledge that stretched back 3 generations. Herbs and roots and ways of treating fever that her grandmother had taught her in whispers, techniques her mother had refined before being sold away when Dinah was 12. But it was her hands that set her apart. Steady, certain, able to find the source of pain with a touch and ease it with pressure points she understood intuitively. Blackwood had purchased her 8 years earlier from a plantation in South Carolina, paying a premium because the seller emphasized her medical skills. "She's saved more workers than she's cost," the man had said, and Blackwood, always calculating value, had recognized an asset. What he'd failed to recognize was what else she carried. Dinah moved through worlds others couldn't access. In the morning, she'd be in the fields, showing newer workers how to pace themselves to avoid heat stroke, how to recognize when someone was about to collapse so you could steady them before the overseer noticed. By afternoon, she might be called to the big house to treat the overseer's chronic back pain, mixing poultices in the kitchen house while the white household staff talked around her as if she were furniture, revealing information they'd never intentionally share. Evening brought the real work. The enslaved community came to her with everything: infected wounds, difficult pregnancies, children burning with fever, old people whose bodies were giving out after decades of brutality. Her cabin had become an unofficial infirmary, though Blackwood didn't know the half of what happened there. She spoke 3 languages fluently: English, Gullah from her childhood, and enough medical Latin picked up from treating a doctor who'd visited the plantation years ago. She could read, though she hid it carefully, having learned by studying the medicine labels on bottles she was allowed to handle. But it was her ability to listen that made her dangerous. In the big house, while treating Blackwood's chronic digestive issues, she'd hear him discussing breeding schedules with Thorne. In the quarters, while setting a dislocated shoulder, she'd learn which families were being targeted next. In the fields, while treating sun poisoning, she'd discover which enslaved people had been designated as prime breeding stock. She was the connector, the hub. Information flowed through her like blood through a heart, and she kept it all moving, kept everyone informed, kept the community one step ahead of Blackwood's plans when possible. The enslaved community trusted her absolutely. When a woman learned she'd been assigned to the breeding house, Dinah was the first person she'd seek out. When a man discovered his daughter had been paired with her half-brother, Dinah heard his rage and grief and helped channel it into survival rather than suicidal resistance. She'd delivered 47 babies on Blackwood Plantation. 14 of them hadn't lived past their first year. 9 had been born with devastating birth defects, cleft palates, twisted spines, hearts with holes in them. She'd held those babies while they struggled for every breath. She'd helped their mothers make impossible decisions about mercy, and she'd watched Blackwood record it all in his ledger with the detachment of a scientist observing bacterial cultures. Her competence gave her access, her healing gave her trust. But what gave her power was something else entirely. She remembered everything. Every family connection, every forced pairing, every child born from Blackwood's genetic experiments. She kept it all in her mind, a living ledger that contradicted his written one, because she recorded the human cost he never bothered to calculate. The community knew that when Dinah spoke, you listened. When she touched your shoulder in a certain way, you understood something was coming. When she mixed certain herbs in specific combinations, you knew to be ready for bad news. She'd seen Blackwood's system from every angle. She'd treated the women broken by it, the children warped by it, the men destroyed by being forced to participate in it. She'd stood in the breeding house holding the hand of a 16-year-old girl being forced to mate with her own uncle, unable to stop it, but refusing to let the girl face it alone. And through it all, she'd maintained a mask of servility so perfect that Blackwood actually believed she was grateful for her position. He had no idea she was mapping his entire operation, noting guard rotation patterns, tracking which enslaved people had specialized knowledge, who could navigate by stars, who could pick locks, who could forge documents. She was building something in the shadows piece by piece, patient as a spider spinning a web, because Dinah understood something Blackwood's education had never taught him. Systems can only be destroyed from within, and she was already inside every part of his machine. The paradox of her existence was this: the better she performed her healing duties, the more access she gained. The more access she gained, the more she learned. The more she learned, the clearer it became that healing alone would never be enough. Some cancers required cutting. Some infections required burning out. And Blackwood Plantation was both. Leave in the comments. Never stop pursuing truth if you believe justice should reach all the oppressed. She'd been keeping count since she arrived. Every act of violence, every forced pairing, every baby that died because its parents shared too much blood. The mental ledger grew heavier each year, but she never let herself forget a single entry. Year 1. She'd treated Sarah, 17 years old, after Sarah's forced pairing with her half-brother resulted in a pregnancy that nearly killed her. The baby lived 3 days, its heart too small to function properly. Blackwood's journal entry: Subject 45F, pregnancy unsuccessful. Genetic compression moderate. Subject remains viable for future breeding. Year 2. Marcus, a field hand, was whipped unconscious for refusing to enter the breeding house with his own daughter. Dinah had cleaned his wounds, 43 lashes that laid his back open to the muscle. He'd survived, but never spoke again. Something inside him severed beyond her ability to heal. Blackwood's journal: Subject 78M disciplined for resistance to breeding protocol. Compliance achieved. Year 3. Twin babies, born to first cousins who'd been paired deliberately. One died within hours, skull malformed. The other lived 2 months, seizing constantly before finally succumbing. Dinah had stayed with that mother every night because there are some griefs too large to bear alone. Blackwood's journal: Breeding pair 12Mi23F produced non-viable offspring. Genetic compression severe. Recommend terminating breeding line. The horror escalated like a fever, burning hotter each season. Year 4 brought the breeding house expansion. Blackwood had decided his experiment needed a larger scale. He purchased 12 more enslaved people specifically for their genetic backgrounds, brought them to Mississippi, and immediately began forced pairings based solely on his theories about bloodline consolidation. Dinah treated the newcomers for shock, for malnutrition from the journey, for the 1,000 invisible wounds of being torn from everything they'd known. And she watched them realize where they'd been brought, what was expected of them. She saw the light die in their eyes, saw them make the same calculations every enslaved person made. Resistance meant death, but compliance might mean something worse. Year 5. A woman named Rebecca threw herself into the Yazoo River while 6 months pregnant with her brother's child. They pulled her body out 3 days later. Dinah had prepared it for burial, had washed the swollen belly, and felt the baby still moving inside, a life that would never know anything but this. Blackwood's journal: Subject 67F self-terminated. Pregnancy lost. Notable waste of resources. Recommend increased surveillance. Year 6. Blackwood began separating children from their mothers at age 4 instead of age 8, believing earlier separation would make them more malleable to his breeding program. Dinah treated 37 cases of children who'd stopped eating, stopped speaking, who rocked themselves to sleep crying for mothers they could see but weren't allowed to touch. She'd hold these children. Hold them. and sing songs in Gula that her own grandmother had sung to her. Words Blackwood couldn't understand, but that carried comfort older than his theories. She watched. She remembered. And she felt something inside her calcifying, hardening into something that scared her because she'd always been a healer, had always believed in preserving life. But what was happening on Blackwood Plantation wasn't life. It was a mockery of life, a systematic destruction of humanity disguised as agricultural management. The moment she realized the full scope of Blackwood's plan came in year 7. She'd been called to the big house to treat Blackwood's migraine. While preparing her remedies in his study, she'd glimpsed an open ledger on his desk, not the usual breeding records, but a projection. Blackwood had calculated how long it would take to create an entirely self-sustaining population of enslaved people who were so genetically interrelated that they'd be unable to conceive of escape. His theory: people with severe genetic limitations would be too damaged physically and mentally to plan rebellion, too dependent on their slaveholders for basic survival to risk freedom. He'd titled the document, "The Perfection of Bondage Through Bloodline Science." She'd read it in the 15 seconds she had while he was in another room, memorized every word, and felt something snap inside her chest like a bone breaking cleanly. That night, treating a woman who'd just been forcibly impregnated by her nephew, Dinah finally spoke the words that had been building for 7 years. "This has to end, whatever it costs, however long it takes. This ends." The woman had looked at her with eyes hollowed by trauma and whispered back, "Then end it. We're already dead. Everything after that is just waiting." Dinah understood then that she wasn't just witnessing horror. She was being appointed by the community as its executioner, its knife, its flame. From that night forward, every herb she collected, every treatment she administered, every conversation she had carried a dual purpose. She was still a healer, but she was becoming something else. She was becoming a reckoning. June 14th, 1847. The date burned itself into Dinah's memory with the permanence of a brand. The day had started like any other. Pre-dawn bell, assignment to the big house for routine medical duties. The weight of knowledge she carried growing heavier with each breath. But routine shattered at approximately 2 p.m. when Thorne brought her 9-year-old daughter, Kisi, to the breeding house. Kisi. Named for the Yoruba word for born when father was in difficulty, because Dinah had delivered her alone in a storm while Blackwood was away, and the overseer wouldn't allow anyone to help. Kezi, who'd inherited her mother's quick mind and careful hands, who'd been learning the healing arts by watching Dinah mix poultices and set bones. Kezi, who Blackwood had decided was old enough to begin preliminary breeding assessments. The guard who came for Dinah didn't explain why she was needed at the breeding house. They never did. She'd grabbed her medical bag and walked across the yard, the afternoon heat making everything shimmer like the world was dissolving at its edges. The breeding house door was open. She could hear Casey crying, not the cry of pain, but the cry of terror, the sound a child makes when they don't understand what's happening, but their body knows it's wrong. Inside, in room 7, Blackwood stood with his ledger. Thorne held Casey's arm. And on the straw mattress sat Joseph, 17 years old, tears streaming down his face, because Joseph was Casey's half-brother through Blackwood's previous breeding assignments. "Ah, Dinah," Blackwood said, not even looking up from his notes. "Good. I need you to conduct a physical examination. The girl needs to be assessed for breeding viability. I'm documenting early-stage development to refine my timeline predictions." Time stopped, then started again. Wrong. Dinah's voice came from somewhere outside herself. "She's 9 years old. I'm aware of her age. I'm also aware that early assessment will allow me to optimize her breeding schedule when she reaches maturity. This is standard livestock protocol, Dinah. Surely you understand the value of long-term planning." Kisi was looking at her mother with eyes that were begging for safety, for protection, for the kind of rescue that didn't exist in this world. Joseph was shaking, clearly having been threatened with violence if he didn't comply. And Dinah understood in that crystalline moment that if she didn't perform this examination, Blackwood would have someone else do it. Someone who wouldn't be gentle, someone who wouldn't care about minimizing trauma. She'd spent 8 years treating the victims of this system, 8 years holding hands and whispering comfort and easing pain where she could. 8 years being useful, being valuable, being alive by being the healer. But there are some things that break a mother past healing. "I'll conduct the examination," she heard herself say, voice empty of everything but calculation. Blackwood smiled. "Excellent. Document everything. I want precise measurements." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Dinah's life. She performed the examination with clinical detachment while her mind separated into pieces, one part going through the medical motions, one part whispering apologies to her daughter, one part planning what came next. Because something did come next. Something had to come next. When it was over, Casey was returned to the quarters. Joseph was dismissed. Blackwood congratulated Dinah on her thoroughness and asked her to prepare his dinner tonic. She went to the kitchen house. Mixed foxglove with his regular herbs. Not enough to kill, just enough to make him violently ill for a few days. She wanted him to suffer, wanted him weakened, wanted him vulnerable. But more than that, she wanted time. Time to gather what she'd been preparing for 8 years. Time to send the signals she'd established with the community. Time to implement the plan that had been forming in the dark corners of her mind since she'd read his ledger projection. That night, she held Casey in their cabin and whispered in Gula, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill all of them. And then I'm going to burn this place until nothing remains but ash." Kessie, 9 years old but aged by trauma, whispered back, "Promise. I promise." In the traditional burial customs Dinah's grandmother had taught her, there was a ritual for the dead that required marking the body with red clay, wrapping it in white cloth, and singing it home to the ancestors. That night, Dinah painted red clay on her own forehead and Kesey's, wrapped white cloth around their wrists, and sang the songs of the dead. Because the Dinah who had believed in healing within the system died in that breeding house room. What emerged was something else entirely. Patient, precise, and past any possibility of mercy. She'd kept her daughter alive for 9 years in this hell. She'd tried to protect her. She'd tried to work within the constraints of the possible. But Blackwood had revealed the truth. There were no constraints that would protect Kessie. No amount of usefulness would prevent Dinah's daughter from being absorbed into his genetic experiment. The system couldn't be negotiated with. It could only be destroyed. She spent 3 nights performing the mourning rituals for herself, for the healer she'd been, for the innocence she'd tried to preserve in her daughter. And on the 4th night, she began war preparations. The contract was signed in blood that night, her own, pricked from her thumb and pressed against the cabin wall where only she would see it. A promise sealed not to any god but to something older and angrier and more absolute than faith. Blackwood had made a tactical error. He'd touched her child, and Dinah had been keeping records longer than he had. Cornelius Blackwood was not the only monster at the plantation, just the most powerful one. The system he'd built required a complete hierarchy of cruelty, each layer supporting the next, and each participant specialized in their own methods of degradation. At the top, Blackwood himself, the architect, the theorist, the man who could discuss breeding protocols over brandy and never once consider that he was discussing human beings. His particular cruelty was philosophical. He genuinely believed in the scientific merit of his work, saw himself as a progressive thinker, advancing agricultural science. He kept a collection of skulls, 17 of them, lined up in his library, from enslaved people who died with genetic abnormalities, using them to support his theories about bloodline consolidation. His wife, Constance, had her own specialties. She ran the big house with obsessive precision, and her particular domain was punishment through separation. Children taken from mothers at her discretion. Families split when she deemed it necessary for household efficiency. She'd once sold a 6-month-old baby because its crying disturbed her sleep, and when the mother collapsed in grief, Constance had her whipped for dramatic behavior. Then came Jameson Thorne, the overseer. A man who'd failed at everything else in life until he discovered he had a talent for systematic brutality. Thorne specialized in psychological torture, public humiliations, forced participation in the degradation of loved ones, elaborate punishments designed to break spirits rather than just bodies. He kept a journal of his own, detailing which methods produced the most effective compliance. Under Thorn, 4 drivers, all enslaved men forced into their positions through threats against their families. Each carried the weight of complicity, forced to administer punishments or watch their own children suffer. Their names, Isaiah, Thomas, Benjamin, and Marcus. Each had his own method of surviving the impossible position Blackwood had forced them into. Each hated himself a little more every day. The guards rotated in shifts, 8 white men from the surrounding counties who were paid to patrol, to watch, to enforce. They had permission to use any force necessary short of killing, and they interpreted that permission broadly. But the system required more than force. It required the complete destruction of hope, and for that, Blackwood had implemented layers of surveillance and control that extended beyond physical violence. There was the informant program. Enslaved people promised better food, lighter work, protection for their families if they reported resistance. Blackwood had 7 active informants he trusted, and he'd skillfully planted false information through them to root out others. The community knew about most of them, but not all. There was the debt system. Enslaved people were charged for their own clothing, their food rations, medical treatment. The debts were fictional, impossible to repay, but they served their purpose, creating the illusion that freedom was achievable through compliance and hard work, when in reality the numbers were designed to ensure perpetual bondage. There was the documentation obsession. Blackwood photographed enslaved people regularly, kept detailed records of their lineages, tracked them with the same precision a scientist tracks laboratory specimens. He had daguerreotypes of every forced pairing, kept in albums he showed to visiting plantation owners to demonstrate his methods. And there was the breeding house itself, the physical manifestation of his theories. 12 rooms, each designed for maximum control. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, but thin enough that those waiting in adjacent rooms could hear everything, a calculated amplification of terror. Each antagonist had their role. Each contributed to the machine. But in June 1847, an external catalyst arrived that would prove to be the final accelerant in a building explosion. His name was Dr. Nathaniel Crane, a physician from Boston who'd heard of Blackwood's work through academic correspondence. Crane was writing a paper on hereditary traits in servile populations and wanted to observe Blackwood's breeding program firsthand. Blackwood, always eager for intellectual validation, welcomed him enthusiastically. Crane arrived June 20th, 1847, 6 days after the incident with Kessie. He was given a tour of the facilities. He was shown the breeding house. He was presented with Blackwood's ledgers, his photographs, his skull collection, and he was invited to witness a forced pairing scheduled for June 27th, Blackwood's most ambitious experiment yet, involving 3 generations of the same family bloodline. Dinah learned of this plan on June 22nd when she was called to the big house to treat Crane's travel-related digestive issues. While preparing his medicine, she overheard him and Blackwood discussing the upcoming demonstration. Crane's words, "Fascinating. The implications for understanding genetic compression are profound. I'll want to document the physical examination thoroughly." Blackwood's response, "Of course. I've prepared detailed anatomical measurements. The subjects are 3rd-generation participants in the program, which should provide excellent data." Dinah's hands had continued mixing herbs with perfect steadiness, while her mind crystallized around a single understanding. This wasn't just about Blackwood anymore. This was about an entire system, an entire philosophy that extended beyond one plantation. Crane represented the academic legitimization of horror, the transformation of atrocity into publishable science. If Blackwood was the engineer of this system, Crane was proof that others would build on his design. The point of no return wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of every atrocity witnessed, every child damaged, every woman broken, every man forced into complicity. But the specific moment when Dinah's calculated fury found its final form came on June 23rd, when she saw the 3 family members who'd been designated for Crane's demonstration. A grandmother, 47 years old. Her daughter, 26. Her daughter's son, 15. They'd been locked in separate rooms of the breeding house, awaiting the demonstration. The grandmother was Sarah, the same woman Dinah had treated in year 1, whose heart-damaged baby had died in 3 days. The daughter was that baby's replacement, born the following year from another forced pairing. The son was the 3rd generation, already showing signs of genetic damage, a learning disability, problems with fine motor control, and Blackwood planned to force them into a multi-generational breeding event for Crane's academic observation. Dinah had been called to ensure they were medically fit for the procedure. She examined them. She documented their health. She looked into Sarah's eyes and saw nothing there but exhaustion so complete it had transcended into a kind of terrible peace. "Do what you have to do," Sarah whispered. "We're past saving. But maybe you can stop it from happening to others." That night, Dinah sent the signal she'd established years before, a specific song, hummed while walking past certain cabins. The tune was innocent, a common work song, but the people who needed to hear it understood. The network activated. The plan that had been theoretical became immediate, and Dinah, the healer, completed her transformation into something else entirely. July 1st, 1847. High noon. The day was scorching, humidity thick enough to choke on, and Dinah stood in the center of the plantation yard waiting for Thorne. This part of the plan required witnesses, required daylight, required the entire enslaved community to see what happened next. Thorne emerged from the big house, irritated at being summoned. "What is it, woman? I don't have time for your—" "You raped my sister," Dinah said. Not loud, not quiet, perfectly measured to carry to every ear in the yard. Dead silence. Even the insects seemed to stop. Thorne's face went through a complicated series of expressions, confusion, recognition, then calculated dismissal. "I don't know what you're talking about. Get back to work before I—" "Her name was Abini. You raped her in the breeding house in 1843. She was 14 years old. You got her pregnant. The baby died because you'd beaten her 2 days before the birth." The enslaved community had gathered now, work stopping, everyone watching this impossible thing unfold. An enslaved woman directly accusing an overseer. Thorne's hand went to his whip. "You've lost your mind. I'm going to have you whipped until—" "You're going to have me whipped in front of everyone?" Dinah's voice remained level. "That seems like a very public acknowledgement that I've said something worth punishing. Or you could deny it. Tell everyone here that I'm lying." The trap was elegant. If he punished her without cause, it confirmed the accusation. If he denied it publicly, she'd established a public record of his crimes that the community would remember. Thorne chose rage. He pulled his whip back. But before he could strike, Dinah spoke again. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a bell struck underwater, rippling outward. Thorne froze. Because there was one rule Blackwood enforced absolutely. No pregnant women were to be physically punished, as it damaged his breeding assets. "You're lying," Thorne said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "I'm 3 months pregnant. You can verify with your master. Strike me, and you'll answer to him for damaging his property." It was a complete fabrication. Dinah wasn't pregnant, but Thorne couldn't verify that without calling Blackwood, and calling Blackwood would mean explaining why he'd been about to whip a valuable medical worker in the middle of the day. The overseer lowered his whip, calculation overtaking fury. "Get to your cabin. You're confined there until I sort this out." "Of course," Dinah said, voice dripping false compliance. She walked to her cabin, head high, while every enslaved person in the yard understood what they'd just witnessed. Their healer, their quiet center, had just publicly defied the overseer and survived. The message was clear. The rules were changing. Once in her cabin, Dinah had exactly what she needed: time. Thorne would spend hours trying to decide how to handle this without looking weak. He'd eventually summon Blackwood from town where he'd gone for supplies. And during that window, Dinah would work. She pulled up the loose floorboard where she'd been hiding materials for 8 years. Arsenic, carefully stolen from rat poison and accumulated in tiny amounts. Foxglove, harvested and dried. Hemp rope, piece by piece. The copied layout of the big house that she'd memorized from treating people there. Names of allies, coded into patterns only she could read. The public humiliation had served its purpose. It had given her confinement, which gave her alibi. Whatever happened next, she would be locked in her cabin, a witness-verified fact. But confinement meant nothing when you had a community of 243 people who understood, without anyone saying it explicitly, that tonight was different. The pieces were in place, the network was ready, and Dinah, locked in her cabin with her daughter, began the final preparations for what would become known throughout Mississippi as the Blackwood cleansing. She mixed the arsenic into a specific honey mixture that Blackwood took nightly for his digestion. She prepared detailed instructions for the allies she'd cultivated. She told Casey every step of what came next, because her daughter deserved to know, deserved to witness, deserved to understand that mothers protect their children by any means necessary. As the sun set on July 1, 1847, 2 hours before the weekly feast Blackwood hosted for his guards and the visiting Dr. Crane, Dinah wrapped her hands in the white burial cloth she'd prepared. The healer was dead. What remained was justice clothed in flesh, and it was finally ready to move. The 4th of July. Blackwood had chosen it deliberately, a celebration of American independence while simultaneously demonstrating the perfection of American bondage. He'd invited neighboring plantation owners, fellow believers in his methods, to witness what he called the culmination event. The 3-generational breeding demonstration scheduled for July 5th, preceded by a feast on the evening of July 4th. 200 enslaved people had been working for 3 days preparing food. The big house gleamed with extra candles. Tables had been set up on the lawn. Blackwood had commissioned a photographer to document the event. It was, in every sense, a celebration of his system's success. What Blackwood didn't know was that parallel preparations had been underway. The network Dinah had built moved like blood through veins, invisible, essential, coordinated. Every person had their role, their signal, their moment. 3 p.m., July 4th. Isaiah, one of the drivers forced into complicity, made his choice. He told Dinah's messenger exactly where Blackwood stored the key to the armory in the big house, in his desk, 3rd drawer, under false bottom. 4 p.m. Sarah, the grandmother designated for the demonstration, requested permission to bathe before the event. She was escorted to the wash house, where she left the door unlocked from inside as instructed. 5 p.m. Thomas, another driver, deliberately miscounted the evening slave count, reporting all present when 3 were actually missing, the 3 who'd slipped into the wash house through Sarah's unlocked door. 6 p.m. The feast began. Blackwood, Crane, 6 visiting plantation owners, 4 guards eating at a separate table, wine flowing, toasts to agricultural progress, discussions of the next day's demonstration. 6:15 p.m. Dinah's honey and arsenic preparation, delivered in Blackwood's customary evening digestive tonic by a house servant who'd memorized exactly which glass to place where, began its slow work. Not enough to kill quickly. Dinah was far too precise for that, just enough to cause severe cramping, sweating, the urgent need to excuse oneself. 6:30 p.m. The photographer, a man hired from Vicksburg who'd never seen Blackwood's operation before, made a fatal mistake. He wandered toward the breeding house seeking better light for a landscape shot, opened one of the locked doors, and discovered the 3 family members chained inside, awaiting tomorrow's demonstration. The photographer's name was James Whitfield. He'd come to Mississippi believing he was documenting agricultural innovation. What he saw in that room transformed him immediately. Later, his testimony would become crucial to Northern abolitionist movements. But in that moment, he simply stood frozen, camera still in hand, staring at horror. Sarah recognized opportunity. "Take the picture," she told him. "Document what you're seeing. Then go to the feast and tell them you're leaving. Don't explain why, just go. And remember what you saw." Whitfield, shaking, did exactly that. The photograph he took, grandmother, daughter, grandson chained together in the breeding house, would eventually appear in abolitionist newspapers across the North. But that night, he simply packed his equipment and departed, mumbling excuses about light quality. His departure disrupted Blackwood's schedule slightly, but not fatally. The host was too busy dealing with his sudden digestive crisis to care much. 7 p.m. Blackwood excused himself from the feast, retreating to his private chambers to deal with violent cramping. His wife Constance followed to assist, leaving the guests with the guards. 7:15 p.m. The three missing enslaved people emerged from the washhouse carrying tools they'd hidden over months: axes, hammers, rope. They moved to the equipment barn unseen to wait. 7:30 p.m. Night fell. The feast continued. Oil lamps were lit. Music started. Enslaved musicians forced to perform for the entertainment of the men who owned them. But underneath the mandolin and fiddle, another rhythm was building. 8 p.m. The signal. Dinah, still supposedly confined to her cabin, began singing. A mourning song, supposedly for a recent death. But certain phrases, certain repetitions carried weight. The community heard. The community understood. 8:15 p.m. The guards, well-fed and wine-drunk, began their evening patrol. They followed their usual pattern: 2 to the northern fields, 2 to the southern, rotating every hour. What they didn't know was that their pattern had been studied for 8 years, every rotation memorized, every blind spot mapped. 8:30 p.m. Isaiah approached the first guard pair in the northern field. He reported a disturbance near the river, possible escape attempt. This was protocol. The guards took it seriously. They followed him into the darkness. They never made it back. The community had decided. These guards had participated willingly. They'd enjoyed the power. They'd raped, beaten, degraded human beings for wages and sport. The Mississippi bottomlands swallowed them without sound. 8:45 p.m. The second guard pair followed a similar false report to the southern tobacco barn. Same result, same silence. 9 p.m. 4 guards eliminated. 4 more remained at the big house with the guests. This was the delicate part, the part that required precision. Dinah emerged from her cabin. She'd never actually been locked in. Thorne had been too distracted managing the feast to properly secure the door. She walked across the yard openly, brazenly, because this was the critical understanding. People see what they expect to see. An enslaved woman walking toward the big house kitchen during a feast, bringing more food, obviously. She entered through the kitchen house. The cook, part of the network, nodded once. Dinah picked up a tray of desserts, actual desserts, because the best disguises are functional. She walked into the dining room where the remaining guests were laughing, drunk, discussing tomorrow's demonstration. She served dessert. And while she served, she listened to Dr. Crane explaining his theories on genetic compression, listened to the plantation owners debating the commercial applications of selective breeding, listened to them discuss human beings like livestock while those human beings stood in the room serving food. One of the guests, a man from Georgia named Patterson, looked at her directly and said to Blackwood, "Your healer looks ill. Are you certain she's fit for service?" Blackwood, pale and sweating from the arsenic, waved dismissively. "She's fine. She's always dramatic. Continue your point about the Virginia experiments." Dinah returned to the kitchen, set down the empty tray, looked at the cook. "Now," she said. The cook extinguished the kitchen fires, every lamp, every candle. The building went dark. And in the main house, someone screamed. What happened in the big house between 9:30 p.m. and midnight on July 4, 1847, was reconstructed from multiple testimonies. Some enslaved people who participated, some who witnessed from the quarters, and one surviving guest who testified later in court, his voice shaking too much to be believed. The darkness was absolute. The oil lamps had been extinguished systematically, every light source removed. The remaining 4 guards reacted with military training, drawing weapons, trying to establish defensive positions. But they were defending against shadows. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation had spent their entire lives moving in darkness, navigating by touch and sound, understanding the space in ways the guards never could. The big house was familiar territory to those who'd cleaned it, cooked in it, served in it. Every floorboard that creaked, every door that stuck, every corner that offered concealment, they knew. The first guard fell at 9:35 p.m., struck from behind with a hammer as he tried to light a lamp. The sound of his body hitting the floor brought the others running, which was exactly the point. Concentrate them. Funnel them. The second fell at 9:40 p.m. in the main hallway, rope around his throat, tightening with the skill learned from decades of handling livestock. A specific knowledge turned back on its teachers. The third and fourth barricaded themselves in Blackwood's study with the plantation owners, including Dr. Crane. They had 2 rifles and defensive positions. They should have been safe. But Dinah understood something about Blackwood's pride. He'd designed the big house with a servant's passage running behind the walls, allowing enslaved people to move unseen while serving. The passage had doors that opened into nearly every room, including the study. At 10 p.m., smoke began filtering under the study door, not from fire, from green tobacco leaves and damp moss, creating thick, choking smoke that obscured vision and induced coughing. The men inside had a choice: stay and suffocate, or emerge and face what waited. At 10:15 p.m., Dr. Crane broke. He opened the door, hands raised, coughing violently. The smoke cleared. The remaining guards followed, weapons ready. They found themselves surrounded, not by chaos or rage, but by organization. The enslaved community had arranged itself in a specific formation. Isaiah and the other drivers at the front, their families behind them, and arrayed in careful ranks, every person who'd suffered under this system. Dinah stood in the center, holding not a weapon but Blackwood's own ledger, the one detailing every forced pairing, every genetic experiment, every child born damaged and discarded. "You will answer for what's written here," she said. "But first, you will understand what you've done." What followed was trial by testimony. Each person spoke, told their story. The guards and guests were forced to stand, forced to listen, forced to hear the human cost of what they'd celebrated over dinner. Sarah spoke first, describing each of her 5 children, born from forced pairings with cousins and uncles, describing watching 4 of them die from genetic defects, describing the one who survived but couldn't speak or walk at age 12. Then her daughter spoke, describing being raped by her own half-brother at Blackwood's instruction, describing giving birth to a baby with no kidneys, describing holding that baby for the 6 hours it took to die. Then the grandson spoke, his words slurred from the neurological damage he'd been born with, but every syllable clear enough. "You made me wrong. You made me sick. You did this on purpose." Person after person, hour after hour. The litany of horror, detailed with precision. Dr. Crane vomited halfway through. One of the guards began crying. Patterson, the man from Georgia, tried to argue. "This is legal. This is property management. You have no—" "Shut your mouth," Isaiah said, and the authority in his voice, a man who'd been forced to whip his own brother under this system, was absolute. At 11:30 p.m., Blackwood himself appeared, emerging from his chambers, still pale and cramping, but drawn by the commotion. His wife followed, imperious even now. The crowd parted to let them through. Dinah approached Blackwood directly. She opened his ledger to a specific page, the entry detailing Kesey's assessment for breeding viability. "Read it aloud," she commanded. "I don't take orders from—" The hammer came from nowhere, striking his hand, the one that had held the pen that had written those words. Bones shattered with a sound like green wood breaking. Blackwood screamed. "Read it with your other hand," Dinah said, "or I'll take that one too." He read, voice shaking. Subject 167F, female, age 9, preliminary breeding assessment conducted June 14, 1847. Physical development, premature. Recommended age for initial breeding, 12 years. Proposed pairing, subject 89M, half-sibling match, to test genetic compression at second-generational level. The words hung in the air, each syllable an indictment. "That's my daughter," Dinah said quietly. "My daughter that you assessed for breeding like she was a dog. My daughter that you planned to rape by proxy through a forced pairing with her own brother." She turned to the assembled community. "What is the judgment?" The response was unanimous and wordless. Every person there had suffered. Every person there had lost someone. Every person there knew that mercy had no place in this reckoning. What happened to Cornelius Blackwood between 11:45 p.m. and midnight was deliberate. It was measured. Each person who'd lost a child to his genetic experiment struck one blow. Each woman who'd been forced into the breeding house struck another. Each man forced to participate struck his own. But none killed him. That was reserved. Dinah administered the final justice with precise anatomical knowledge, ensuring maximum suffering before death. The method echoed every forced breeding he'd orchestrated. Violation is retribution. Degradation answered with degradation. And when it was done, she turned to the others. Constance Blackwood, Thorne, Crane, the guards, the visiting owners. "You have one choice," she said. "You can run north. You can try to escape. Or you can wait here and explain to whoever comes what happened and why." Most ran. Crane ran fastest, stumbling into the night, his academic theories shattered against reality. But Thorne didn't run. Thorne, who'd brutalized hundreds of people, who'd raped Dinah's sister, who'd implemented every cruel detail of Blackwood's system, Thorne drew a pistol from his coat. He never fired it. Isaiah's axe took his arm at the shoulder, and the man who'd whipped Isaiah's brother to death received exactly the mercy he'd shown. None. By midnight, the big house stood silent except for the sound of 243 people breathing freely for the first time in their lives. The fire began at 12:15 a.m., July 5th, 1847. Not chaos, not rage, ritual. Dinah and Sarah, grandmother and granddaughter victims separated by generation, but united by suffering, walked through the big house room by room. In each space they performed a cleansing. Salt scattered for purification, water poured for washing away, and then flame for final erasure. The breeding house burned first. The community gathered around it in a circle, watching the structure that had housed so much violation transform into purifying fire. The iron rings melted in the heat. The straw mattresses became ash. The wooden beams collapsed inward, and with them, the physical manifestation of Blackwood's genetic nightmare. As it burned, people sang. Not songs of celebration, but the old songs, the ones from before the ships, from before the chains. Songs in languages Blackwood had tried to erase but which survived in throats and hearts. Yoruba, Igbo, Bantu. The words merged into a collective prayer that transcended single meanings. Next, the big house. Room by room systematically. Blackwood's library with his skull collection, his journals, his breeding records, all of it fed to flames. Constance's fine china shattered in the heat. The photographer's equipment, abandoned in his flight, melted into slag. But the ledgers, Blackwood's meticulous documentation of his experiments, those Dinah saved. One copy for evidence, one for memory. The truth documented by the architect of horror, preserved by his victims. The fire burned through the night, visible for miles across the Mississippi Delta, drawing curious neighbors who arrived to find 243 formerly enslaved people, organized, armed, and absolutely unwilling to be returned to bondage. Dawn came with a new problem. What next? The community gathered in the yard as the big house collapsed into embers. They'd destroyed the system, but they stood in Mississippi, surrounded by other plantations, with militia that would inevitably come. Dinah addressed them. "We have three choices. Stay and fight the militia. We'll die but maybe inspire others. Split up and try individual escapes. Some might make it north. Or move together, organized, like Sherman's March, but in reverse." The debate lasted 2 hours. Families argued. Individuals made different choices. This was freedom. Messy, uncertain, but finally theirs to choose. In the end, 184 chose to move together north. 23 chose to head west to Mexico. 14 stayed to fight. The rest made individual decisions. At 8 a.m., the column began to move. Dinah led the largest group, with Sarah and Kessie beside her. They'd gathered supplies from the plantation stores, weapons from the armory, and something more valuable: Blackwood's detailed maps showing every plantation, every slave patrol route, every safe water source between Mississippi and Ohio. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation walked away from the ruins of their bondage carrying fire in jars, kept alive from the cleansing flames. Symbolic and practical, fire for cooking, for signaling, for defending, for continuing the work of burning down bondage wherever they found it. The 15-year-old boy, Sarah's grandson, carried a banner they'd made from a torn white sheet. On it, written in soot and blood, "The bloodline ends here." Behind them, the fire still burned. The smoke column rose straight into the windless summer air, visible for 30 miles in every direction. It was a beacon, a warning, a promise. And as they walked, Dinah felt something shift in her chest. The weight she'd carried for 8 years, the ledger of horrors memorized, the responsibility of survival, didn't disappear, but transformed. She'd been the healer who bore witness. Now she was something else. She was the first striker in what would become a wave. The Mississippi sunrise painted the smoke column gold and red, and somewhere in the distance church bells began to ring alarm. The system had noticed. The response was coming. But for now, 184 people walked free, and that was enough. The fire at Blackwood Plantation was visible from the Vicksburg courthouse 37 miles away. By noon on Irie,